Some call it flawed and unlikely to work on the ground. Yet the US and Russia hope a cessation of hostilities in Syria will pave the way for a political settlement. But with many armed groups excluded, how do they plan to enforce it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. After years of fighting and months of diplomatic wrangling, the US and Russia have agreed to a so-called cessation of hostilities in Syria. It's supposed to start first thing on Saturday and requires both countries to persuade their allies on the ground to stop fighting. But there are major problems. The agreement excludes ISIL and the al-Nusra Front and allows airstrikes to continue against both those groups. And Syrian rebels say the exclusion of al-Nusra gives Russia a pretext to continue to attack areas where all the rebel groups are tightly packed. But despite the issues, Russia's President Vladimir Putin says the deal offers a real chance of ending the bloodshed in Syria.
Russia will work with Damascus, the legitimate government of Syria. We expect the United States will do the same with its allies and groups supported by them. I'm sure these common activities agreed with the American side will be able to turn around the crisis situation in Syria. This is a real chance to stop the long-standing bloodshed and violence.
Well, let's now bring in our guests for today's discussion. Joining me here in the studio is Jean-Marc Rickli, Associate Fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. In Moscow, Mark Sleboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. And in London, Justin Bronk, Research Analyst in the Military Sciences team at the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Justin Bronk in London. Why do you think this agreement would work when the one that was reached in Munich a short time ago never really caught any traction?
I think this agreement has a chance to work politically because in this case the conflict is now much more driven by external actors even than it was during the previous talks. If Russia, and particularly through its influence on Assad, the Syrian Air Force as well, do stop their bombing campaigns, particularly around besieged areas in Aleppo and various other places, I think there's a better chance now of the opposition agreeing in those areas to a ceasefire, at least for a while. Of course, the problem there is that the Russian and Syrian definition of, that is, regime definition of Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIL also encompass a lot of the groups which the West, and particularly those groups themselves, would see as not jihadist and as much more as legitimate opposition. So I think whether the bombing campaign stops, which has been one of the key conditions for the ceasefire to have a chance from opposition groups, will be a key test for this.
Well, Mark Sleboda, your view, do you think there is a chance that the agreement will be met and the bombing campaign will stop, which, as we're hearing being pointed out here, is a key issue if this truce is going to stick?
No, I don't believe that there's any chance. I think this is just another dud. I think this is both sides, as it were, or the many sides, going through the motions. I believe that this can only be solved on the battlefield. There has to be a much more significant leverage on the battlefield before there can be any political settlement. Neither of the sides, the combatants, really want to stop or will accept negotiations at this point. I think particularly Obama is claiming that he can rein in, Erdogan, this, half-cocked would-be neo-Ottoman sultan, who is at the moment shelling U.S. allies. On top of that, the Kurds. On top of that, we have U.S. proxy forces, the Kurds, and the al-Qaeda allied Free Syrian Army shooting at each other. The U.S. is effectively at a proxy war itself. And then claiming to speak on behalf of the two largest combatants on the field supported by the Gulf dictatorships, that is Al-Qaeda and Ahrar al-Sham, these jihadi forces, I don't think Obama has any ability to rein these in any more than the Saudi or Qatari dictatorships do.
Well, Jean-Marc, Rickli, that's a pretty bleak prognosis we heard there.
Well, indeed, I think there is probably a middle ground here. What we're witnessing is that obviously there are lots of loopholes in this cessation of hostilities and ceasefire agreement that are around the definition of terrorism. Yes, there is ISIS and there are al-Nusra, but there are also groups that are affiliated with al-Nusra that are deemed by the Assad and the Russian as similar. So basically what you have here is first a problem of definition. Who are the parties on the ground who are willing to comply? The only chance that I would see for this agreement to work is, in a way, in the following situation: if one side is very strong, which is the case with Assad and with the support of Russia, they have made major territorial gains over the last few weeks, and therefore they could use this ceasefire in a way to legitimize, to justify the newly gained territories. On the other hand, obviously, the opposition to the Assad regime have lost lots of territories, and they could use this ceasefire to regain some forces. But the prospect of having a true ceasefire are very slim because of the different interests and the different actors on the ground.
Well, Justin Bronk, we've heard Saudi Arabia and Turkey are nominally in support of this truce. However, they've made very clear in the past that they are totally opposed to a ceasefire on the ground that does not have a parallel political process which is transitioning away from Assad rule. What has changed their minds, or indeed have their minds been changed at all?
I don't think Saudi Arabia and Turkey have changed their minds whatsoever in terms of what they're prepared to accept and what they'll do everything in their power to prevent in Syria, which is a perceived victory for Bashar al-Assad, which allows him and his regime to stay in power. There's a question mark over quite how much they can do to prevent that if the direction of travel really solidifies in that direction on the ground. But certainly for Turkey and Saudi Arabia, that would be seen as a victory for particularly Iran and a strong blow against their interests in the region. So they'll certainly try and prevent that from occurring. On the other hand, as has been said, there are huge diverging views on who the ceasefire applies to on the ground. So I think unless there is a meaningful cessation of hostilities against the vast majority of what we in the West at least would term rebel-besieged areas, rather than those held by ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, who are also being bombed by the US, much more so than the Russians, I'd add. Unless that bombing and those sieges meaningfully cease, and opposition groups have today indicated that they will abide by the ceasefire if that does occur, then I think, as has been suggested, there are very, very slim prospects for an actual ceasefire here.
Well, Mark Sleboda, in the enforcement of this agreement, it's been decided that Russia and the US will act as direct guarantors and monitors. Many observers believe this sounds just too ridiculous to be true. These two countries policing themselves, having been at odds for such a long period of time. Your view?
Yeah, I mean, the two countries have barely, very grudgingly managed basic deconfliction in the conflict zone. And I think what other guests have bring up, this definition of what is and what isn't a terrorist, is crucial, and it has not been resolved from the first discussions. We have two UN Security Council resolutions, 2249 and 2254, that openly call for the Security Council members to eradicate ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all individuals, entities, and endeavors that are associated with them. That would seem to include pretty much the entirety of the so-called moderate opposition, the Western and GC proxies, as they are, as the Washington Post and Reuters have confirmed intermingled or basically allied or even embedded with the much larger jihadist forces. In fact, the U.S. and the moderate opposition requested at the end of last week in exactly these terms that Russia should stop attacking al-Qaeda because our forces are allied with them. And that is just a revelation into the true nature of this conflict. And personally, I would like to have President Obama go to the victims and families in New York from 9/11 and tell them why he thinks that Russia should stop bombing al-Qaeda.
Well, Justin Bronk, I saw you shaking your head there. You disagree, I take it?
Absolutely. There's a very, very strong line which is based on the true nature of the conflict in Syria, which is that a large number of fragmented, moderate opposition groups who, let's remember, are fighting the regime which has caused the vast majority of civilian casualties in the Syrian civil war, not ISIL, Assad, who has killed hundreds of thousands of his own people, including with chemical weapons and all of this. But this is according to every civil rights and every human rights watch organization and every international charity that is operating in Syria.
I think you're talking about the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is one rebel propagandist sitting in London.
No, I'm talking about Amnesty, I'm talking about Human Rights Watch, I'm talking about the International Red Cross.
I don't believe Amnesty or International or Human Rights Watch have said that Russia or that the Syrian government is responsible for the majority of the deaths.
Gentlemen, let's not get sidetracked on the minutiae here. Justin Bronk, just to finish your point you were making.
The point being that essentially what the resolutions call for is the eradication of ISIS and al-Qaeda. Now, what the Russians, as well as individuals who operate with them, what the Russians are trying to suggest that this means, along with the Syrian government, is that all of the legitimate opposition forces who rose up against Bashar al-Assad in what initially was a fairly democratic rising, to survive, they have had to intermingle with the strong jihadist Islamist groups in various parts of the country who are leading the fight against Assad there. Now, what the US is trying to do, and it's obviously extremely difficult to do and potentially even impossible, is try to prevent a slaughter of those groups, foreseeing that this will, of course, cause huge problems for terrorism all over the world, including in Russia, if Assad is seen to win. But while keeping up the pressure on ISIL and al-Nusra, who are designated terrorist organizations. And Obama has not said that bombing against al-Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra, or ISIL should be stopped. Quite the opposite.
Well, Jean-Marc Rickli, this is what we do know. On the ground there are numerous factions who are operating. We hear from our other guests the difficulties in terms of saying exactly who is permissible as a target and who is not. But the other issue as well is that these are guerrilla groups. They are moving in difficult terrain. Nobody on the ground, no eyes on the ground. How on earth do they manage to single out, even if there is agreement on who can be targeted or not, how do they single out their particular targets?
Right, that's going to be an issue, and the issue is one of representation. Who are we talking about? We're talking about different groups that shift allegiances. We can see that, for instance, with the Kurds that up until now we're on the side of the opposition. Now they have turned against, and obviously that's a real dilemma for the external power. But if I could just bring some more perspective on the evolution of this conflict, if we are in the situation that we are today, it's probably because the international community did not intervene for the last 5 years, where the international community thought that by letting the people on the ground fight each other will reach a solution. That's not the case. I think what we're witnessing right now is, in a way, the United States having given up on the western part of Syria, prioritizing the fight against ISIS. They are supported in a way by the Europeans since the Paris attack, the French that had an attitude of not choosing either Assad or ISIS in terms of priorities have changed their mind after Paris. And now what we see is probably among the Western allies a priority against ISIS, and therefore some kind of turning a blank eye what's going on in the western part of Syria. And in the end, that benefits the Assad regime, and that angers Turkey and Saudi Arabia and its allies, because obviously those who are losing from this situation are the rebel on the ground. So what we might have with this ceasefire is, in a way, a tactical move to prioritize who are the main target, but it will be far from getting to a resolution because the enduring problem is still there.
Well, Mark Sleboda, some have suggested that there's a somewhat cynical slant to all of this as well, that there are those within the US who are intent on actually containing the situation rather than resolving it. They want to focus all their attention on ISIL, the Syrian war itself. They want to push to the side to keep it manageable and not to detract from what their major aim in the area is, and that is ISIL. Are those cynics correct?
No, I think that's absolutely 100% wrong. I don't think combating ISIL is or has been the priority of the United States this entire time. They remain focused on regime change. I don't think that has changed because of this so-called cessation of hostilities. I believe that will continue. Of course, Obama would attempt to, quote, do this leading from behind. He has funded, armed, trained, and paid the salaries of proxies illegally for the last 5 years to try to overthrow the Syrian government. And I don't believe that with all of the political, economic capital that the U.S., the Saudi dictatorship, the Turkey have invested in this, that they're just going to walk away at this point.
Well, Justin Bronk, you seem destined to be at odds with Mark Sleboda. I see once again you disagreed with some of those points.
Well, that's a position I'm quite happy to be in. But yeah, I mean, it is worth remembering that the United States, despite a clear use of chemical weapons against civilians, chose not to bomb in a fairly embarrassing political move, which credit should go to Mr. Putin for taking good advantage of that, chose not to bomb the Assad regime, even when it clearly violated the prohibition against chemical weapons, and indeed has instead been focusing huge air power over more than a year against ISIL in both Iraq and Syria, along with military observers and JTACs, so Joint Terminal Attack Controllers. It is also worth remembering that they have killed thousands upon thousands of ISIL fighters, destroyed thousands of positions, supported large-scale offensives with varying degrees of success by both the Kurds and the Iraqi security forces against ISIL, and seen large-scale reclamation of territory in both Iraq and, in a limited sense, in Syria, while taking no concrete steps against the regime at all, despite air superiority over Syria. So I think the notion that the US, although it finds Assad deeply distasteful, I would actually criticize the Obama administration, if anything, for the extent to which it's content in many ways to now view Assad as the lesser of two evils, that the opposition side is now too fragmented, it's too mixed up with the extreme jihadists, and therefore, you know, as you say, containing the Syrian conflict and trying to ensure that ISIL doesn't emerge as the major winner, and otherwise working for a ceasefire, messy though that may be, remains their objective. For Russia to suggest that the US is not prioritizing ISIL and indeed is funding proxies, they are arming the Kurds. On the other hand, it's worth remembering that most Russian sorties are striking moderate rebel-held areas in support of an Assad ground offensive. And if you want to look at what very large-scale arming, funding, directing of proxies looks like in a foreign country, they should probably look at Ukraine.
Well, Jean-Marc Rickli, staying with this particular subject, I mean, there we heard the phrase, the US sees Assad as the lesser of two evils. Do you think that is an accurate reflection of the US position, that it does want to concentrate on ISIL at the expense of not pushing hard against the Assad government?
Well, I think that the position of the US is a reflection of its previous history, of its commitment in the region. And there has been some kind of fatigue of US involvement in the region. The US is not supporting the Assad government, has issues obviously with ISIS, and they want to combat ISIS. I think, again, from the West had a strategy of containment. It was very cynical in a way, trying to let the people do their business and get some kind of result at the end. The Russian intervention has completely changed the dynamics on the ground, and now there is a realization that they will not go ahead front against Russia. So there is a middle ground. The middle ground probably is try to prioritize ISIS. And again, once ISIS, if ISIS is being destroyed or removed, the issue of Assad will still be on the table, because this is something that has not been solved, and that is at the core of the problem in Syria. And to argue that the United States is not fighting ISIS, I think it's wrong. Just have to look at the U.S. war effort in Iraq against ISIS. I mean, the Americans are stepping up their contribution. It's just that there is a prioritization now of which should come first, and I think that the fight against ISIS is winning over Assad.
Well, Mark Sleboda, lest we forget, we need to remind our viewers of the massive humanitarian situation that exists in Syria. Is there perhaps an essence of the glass being half full, that no matter the motives for this ceasefire, the cessation of hostilities, that there could be a possibility of getting humanitarian aid to the Syrian people in this vacuum of violence?
I would think that would be a noble aim if it could be true. But as we've seen before, with these terrorist forces literally holding cities and towns hostage across the country, they have rediverted aid. They have charged exorbitant funds for the slightest amounts of food, water. They're regularly doing business, trade with ISIS, with Al-Qaeda, and so on. I mean, we could hope as well for a humanitarian settlement in Yemen, where we have U.S. and Gulf dictatorship forces starving 14 million people. I think to try to focus on a humanitarian crisis at this point, when foreign interference, and this regime change attempts have resulted in the death of 300,000 people, only will draw this out. I think that there needs to be a solution on the ground that will lead to a political solution where the West comes to grips with the terms, and I think that's what negotiations are from the Russian perspective. A 7-step group therapy to help the West come to grips with the fact that they have been illegally funding jihadism in Syria for the last 5 years, and to give them an exit ramp to walk away from it.
Justin Bronk, at best, is this just simply a quick fix? Is there going to be humanitarian relief, do you believe?
There will be humanitarian relief where possible, which is very welcome, particularly much-needed medical supplies for besieged cities, which, I mean, I've never seen a city yet which is entirely run and occupied by terrorists, even if there are, by a strict definition, terrorists there. So it'd be excellent to see aid get through where possible. I don't think this is going to provide a quick fix to the war. In terms of the solution on the ground, advocated particularly by those who support the regime in the Russian position, I mean, at what cost would be my question. Cluster bombing Aleppo last week on Monday, as well as hitting 4 hospitals and 2 schools with unguided weapons, again, I would suggest is an approach costly enough in civilian lives to be worth trying to avoid. Perhaps a firm guiding hand is not the most humanitarian way of doing things. But equally, I would come back on the Yemen point as well and say that I completely agree that the operations in Yemen are causing completely unnecessary human suffering. I would also point out, though, that US forces are not conducting the blockade. It's Saudi.
Well, at that point, my thanks to our guests, Jean-Marc Rickli, Mark Sleboda, and Justin Bronk. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team, goodbye for now.